yeah, first up, our host, and then we'll dig into the star of the show and get started. But we got Albert Ghazi, CEO and founder of Aleph, and Stephen Headland, head of finance at Rillet. So seat change here from Nick, who had to travel last minute, but stoked to have Stephen here and is going to add a ton to the conversation. And yeah, I'm going to pass it on to you guys. We'll start with Albert. Just give us a quick background of yourself and the company, and then we can start digging in.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for having me in your program. Albert here, co-founder, CEO of Aleph. I used to be a management consultant, worked with CFOs there. Then I was CFO myself, and I had that early finance experience that Chris is having. I didn't scale that to 100 million plus, so curious to learn from Chris here. And a little bit about Aleph. We're an AI native FP&A tool. We connect to 150 plus data sources. We put all of that in one place, and then we let you work with that data, be it in spreadsheets, in the web app, and all with the magic of AI. So excited to be here, learning from Chris, and I will pass it over to Stephen.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen, the head of finance at Rillet. Spent my career in finance and accounting. So started at Walmart on SAP. Went to my first startup, did a QuickBooks to NetSuite migration. Next startup I was at Sage Intacct, and story like knew somebody was going to fix it. All useful tools, but really dated. So I met our founder here about a year and a half ago, and kind of said, where do I jump in? And it's been a lot of fun. So Rillet is the AI native ERP. And you can think of it as if NetSuite were built today. So everything you love, multi-entity and reporting and consolidation, with just faster implementations, native integration, so much faster to implement and cleaner data. And then AI native, so everything from natural language reporting to just really clean data that AI loves, frankly. So that's really excited to chat, more about it, but really excited to chat with Chris today. Chris is really like, I don't know, one of like the sharpest finance leaders I've met, but really humble, which is really rare in a finance leader, especially at a startup. So he's just really like a delight to chat with and learn from. Chris has really been at the finance game for quite a while. Also, interestingly enough, has a JD in law as well. So maybe we'll get into that a bit. But in terms of like background, he's been early finance and controller at various startups, been an advisor to startups. He's been at Postscript almost 5 years now. In total, he's helped raise over like $200 million in VC money. So really like an incredible kind of background, lot to learn from. And especially for Postscript, has scaled it from basically zero as the first finance hire up to past 100 million ARR. So kind of a dream that all of us in finance have to be able to do that for a company. So Chris, really excited to learn from you today. So yeah, Chris, maybe to start off, like everyone here I think knows Postscript and knows something with e-commerce, but like what exactly does Postscript do? Like set the stage for us a bit as we jump in.
Yeah, so Postscript, we are a usage-based SaaS company where we provide marketing automation for online retailers, primarily in the Shopify ecosystem. And our main sort of vehicle for marketing is text messaging. The company was founded in late 2018, and we're backed by Greylock and O1 Advisors.
Cool. And then like talk about, so you came in as first finance hire, like what did the finance function look like? Kind of where was the company at the time when you came in?
Yeah, so when I joined, the company was, they had raised their Series B like a 6 months prior to when I joined. And so they were at about 150 employees, about 15 million ARR, and we're scaling very quickly. And the finance team was non-existent. But they use an outsourced accounting firm that we won't get into too much, not a very strong accounting function. And there was also one of our co-founders was basically running the model. And the model when I got there was revenue only, and it had a seasonally adjusted, at least month over month growth rate that was just drug out to the right for 3 or 4 years.
Sounds like a good model. Never seen that.
You would be surprised how far those models get you. Part of the job for me is chatting with a lot of finance teams and a lot of people that like jump into companies that have been maybe run in like in a very simple way. And yeah, I've seen those seasonal adjusting just trends scale to many millions of dollars of revenue.
So got us through Series B, but fortunately, I came in as they were starting to get ready for the Series C, and that was about the time. The investors got a little bit more serious at that point.
So,
Well, talk a bit about like when you came in, like what was kind of like the first thing you did, right? Like even before hiring the team, how did you think about, okay, first finance person and see like, what do I do day one?
Yeah, the day one was get to know the people, right? You got to understand who the team is that's there and what functions are they responsible for. How does everybody work together? And then once you start getting a handle on who the people are, it's really figuring out how does the business work, right? Understanding like what drives revenue, how do we make money, what are the costs that it requires to make that money. So getting a feel for the cog structure. We are a usage-based company, and on text messaging, there's like lots of variable costs. So like really digging in and figuring out what drives that, how do we move the needle on that side, and then also figuring out like how does the sales motion work. Especially in scaling SaaS startups, you have to like really deeply understand the sales motion and able to both forecast accurately, understand where to invest resources, and also how to support those teams.
Yeah, makes sense. Was it kind of, you mentioned like the model was, just kind of dragged forward. Was that kind of what you expected coming in? Was it better, worse? Did you know all this stuff coming in during the interview process?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest learnings that I had during this process was to ask a lot more questions. I asked a lot about revenue. I didn't ask a lot about anything else. So I knew how much funding they had, how much runway they had, what the revenue is looking like. But I realized coming in quickly that COGS was actually going to be a much bigger part of the job than it is at other software companies. And that's something I could have asked during the interview process and probably would have learned. But sort of just thought about it as standard SaaS, and so thought it wasn't a big question.
and what were the main drivers of COGS, Chris, for the audience there?
Yeah, so text messaging, with text messaging, you can't really directly integrate with any of the like carriers to deliver the messages. You have to go through what's called an aggregator. So like a Twilio or an Infobip, those type of companies. And so just really understanding the nuance of like how much it costs to send a text message, but not only that, the breakdown of the different costs by region, but there's different phone number types. And so there was just, there's this massive basically matrix of understanding one message doesn't cost us the same amount no matter where it's sent. And so getting a handle on that and being able to forecast at a granular enough level that we could get accurate on our COGS and margin forecast was really important.
And one question there and one follow-up, Chris, is, again, you start, everything is a mess, like, everything has like opportunity to improve 10x. How I imagine that, the revenue forecasting, you talk about that, now you're talking COGS. I'm sure that if you start to look at, even cash out, why are we paying for all these invoices for things that we don't need? And, we need more controls there as well. How do you think about, okay, I need to start somewhere? And it sounds like COGS was one of the things. Was it like looking at the P&L and saying, hey, you know what, like if I move the needle here, it will make more of an impact than if I move the needle in, reducing our, SaaS cost on the engineering side? Was that kind of the way that you thought about it?
Yeah, I think every business is different, but understanding where the biggest needle movers are and what is important in the market, right? So we came in and when I first started, it was 2021 and growth was absolutely the most important thing, right? And so, yeah, we can move some needle on COGS, but what really mattered was making sure we were making the right investments to drive pipeline, to drive closed ones, to drive increase in growth, right? That changed very quickly in 2022. It no longer became growth at all costs, and it became more like, how do you grow efficiently? And so that's when we started working on things like margin. We started working on sales efficiency metrics, right? How do we move the needle and make sure that we're not, our paybacks aren't too long, our cash conversion cycle is looking good. And so some of it is the whims of the market, I guess. I don't want to say whims because investors aren't like changing their thought process on what a healthy business is every week. But when there's like major movements in the market, you have to think about what that impact is on your business and how that may impact your future fundraising and exit opportunities and things as well.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm thinking about like when you're kind of like first finance hire, you said like growth, all that matters kind of when you come in. We're at a similar stage now here at Rillet. Like we've got some traction, have a lot of customers, we've raised Series A for Sequoia, like we exist in the market. And also like when I'm looking at my own work day to day, I feel like I'm just fighting fires all the time, right? Like how do I even like think about, like I want to get to some strategic point where I can start to think about my team, think about my tools, but like when am I supposed to do that is what it feels like with the calendar of the day. So how did you think about that early on, even like the simple stuff of blocking time or like finding time to start to think about thinking strategically?
Yeah. And I don't know about you guys, but part of the reason I like working for scaling startups is the firefighting. There's got to be some amount of that. Otherwise, things get a little bit repetitive and stale. But it's important to also know that if you're in constant firefighting mode, you can't ever get to a spot where things are getting better, right? You're just always figuring out what's next. And so it takes a really conscious effort to carve off some time to think about where can I start chipping away at the things that are going to make the repeatable processes easier and also make some of the firefighting easier in the future. And so really dedicating that time to figure those things out. For example, when I came into Postscript, the first thing was we had to bring our accounting in-house. External accounting just wasn't going to work for us as we were continuing to scale. And so figuring out what that process looks like and what the tech stack needed to be, including things like, credit cards, banking platform, accounts payable, automation, even payroll. We made a switch from Gusto to Rippling in my first 9 months there. And that was an incredible change because Gusto was challenging at 200 employees. But then on the FP&A side too, it's like figuring out, making sure you have the right tooling so that you're not like constantly going to pull new reporting. We actually fortunately met, Aleph really early on, and we were realizing that to do any sort of analysis, I was like downloading reports from Snowflake, writing some SQL, figuring out, what was actually the truth in Salesforce, as we had a very, very small RevOps team back then. And even like pulling in stuff from like Gusto to get payroll stuff. And so mashing all that together became very challenging. And so making sure you get the right tech stack in place so that you can spend less time wrangling data and more time automating your processes and also just doing the analysis can help you then carve off that time to start building better processes for the future.
Makes sense.
We'll add that straight into our marketing collateral, Chris. We'll clip it, start paying you royalties if it works out, because I think you put it very nicely.
I like that.
And one of the things, that I think you touched on, right, was about hiring and about bringing accounting in-house. How do you think about, that transition from a team of one to like a team of N, how to face the hires? Is there anything that, knowing what you know now, you would have done differently? I think I know a few interesting stories there, so would love for the audience to learn more about that.
Yeah. So when we first started building the accounting team, I thought, we're a Series C company at this point. People are going to want a controller. They think a controller is going to be an important role. But I also need somebody who can operationally do the month-end close process, things like that. So I hired a senior accountant and a controller basically simultaneously. In retrospect, I think that, a learning there is that it is really hard to hire both those roles at the same time. For me, I probably would have started with a senior accountant, get somebody in who can really like do the day-to-day work of the accounting team. That would have allowed us to start offloading the outsourced accountant without also trying to establish a lot of forward-looking processes at the same time. I have the benefit where I've had some good accounting background. Not all like FP&A people are going to have that same structure, and so you might need somebody more senior level on the accounting side. But if you have sort of the background or the time and enthusiasm to learn how to run an accounting team, it's a great place to be able to like actually bring in that first person who is going to be doing the work.
When you kind of think about that first person, do you look for someone with prior startup background, prior Big Four? Like what kind of profiles are you looking for? What have you seen work well versus maybe not?
Yeah, I've hired from both profiles. For me, I think that the startup background can be extremely helpful. And so for that like first accounting hire, I really do like hiring from a startup environment. Who's now my director of accounting, she came in as a senior staff accountant basically, but she has previous startup experience and like just the culture of like understanding what falls above the line and below the line for startup accounting, especially pre-audit, is like really important. But then, you know, we eventually did hire somebody with a Big Four background as we were getting closer to our first audit to come in and really establish those processes, making sure that we had, you know, all of our memos set up, our workbook set up correctly. And we moved from like, how do we close the books in a way that we can run the business and like pay our taxes and do like the key things that accounting needs to do, to how do we run an auditable business that's scaling and like eventually ready for IPO.
Chris, we'd love to keep talking about the progression of like, you know, after accounting, you know, how do you do it and how would you do it? Maybe quick side question, given you mentioned the audit, when did you start, you know, how was the decision of, you know, saying, okay, hey, we need to really step up our game. We should get started, get audited. How big were you in terms of, you know, revenue, company size, what prompted that decision? I think there's probably people in the audience that are starting to think about that.
Yeah, I'll say we were in both a fortunate and unfortunate position where we negotiated well on when our first audit would need to be. And so our first audit was for fiscal year 2024, when we had nearly $100 million in revenue, which is kind of late for a first audit. And so it had a bunch of its own challenges. That being said, like the timing is often external dependent. It depends on what your investors ask for, what your board asks for. And so understanding how do you build the accounting team for that timing is incredibly important. On the finance side of things, it's more like, I would say for both finance and accounting, my like go-to mantra is like, don't hire until you absolutely must hire. And so just figuring out where are those bend and break points and like how do you augment with software and processes along the way to be able to extend where those break points are. And so I hired my first analyst it was about 8 or 9 months after I started. And so that was when I was really hitting the point where all of the work I was doing day to day became so that if I wanted to keep scaling up sort of the leadership side of my workload, I needed somebody to come in and do things like, you know, BDAs and run the OpEx model and things like that. And so that was my first hire there. I eventually brought in a second analyst more focused on go-to-market, which was like a really great kind of short-term hire. I realized that wasn't like a long-term need for that role. And then today we've gotten to the point where I've hired a director under me to run FP&A, and he has two direct reports.
And Chris, maybe one thing that like also different teams might slice the different problems in different ways. Maybe share a little bit about what's under your scope. For example, you and I have talked a lot about, you know, you owning the deal desk and that part, like RevOps. As you started evolving, you know, did those change hands, change owners? And, you know, if you were to do it again, would you own more at the start? Would you push out and hire leaders earlier? I think that's like a lot of an interesting discussion. There's a lot of things that are clear cut finance owned, but there's a lot that are in a gray area.
Yeah, and analytics and RevOps are two very interesting departments. You know, when I took over analytics, it was like, it sort of started out under engineering, but there was never really anybody under there. Then it was under RevOps for a little bit. And then so we ended up splitting it out and hiring a director. I think that was an extremely good decision. It could, in another world, have reported to our COO and been a completely fine opportunity as well. But finance is one of the biggest consumers of the outputs from analytics, in my opinion. And so like having that close one-to-one relationship there has really helped make sure that we have rock solid financial information and can like build the right path. It also, being like a shared service, allows us to like not over-index BI to any one department, right? If BI lives under engineering, it becomes like a more heavy data engineering platform and like is focused a lot on what engineering needs. If it's under ops, then it can often become an operational resource. And if it's under sales or marketing, then of course it's always focused on go-to-market, and you don't get any of the other stuff that you need. And so finance becomes like a nice place for it to live, because I can kind of align the workloads and the roadmaps for BI with where we're making our investment strategies on the short and long range plan. RevOps, on the other hand, I think like there's kind of two schools of thought there. It should report to the CRO or your head of sales or whatever that may look like at your company, which I think in a lot of ways makes sense, right? They are often the ones that are directing the RevOps workflows and what that looks like. The other school of thought should live under finance, right? RevOps does a lot of
I'm partial to that. I like it under finance, maybe selfish and biased, but I like it.
Yeah, they do a lot of forecasting, and a lot of what they do directly leads into how we think about investing in the business and how we run the business. And so I think the key with having RevOps under finance is that your head of finance or CFO must have a very good relationship with the go-to-market teams, because otherwise you end up in this spot where if they don't trust RevOps, then they're running their own forecasts and their own goal setting, and like comp planning's a mess. And so like it needs to have a really strong relationship for that to work well.
Yeah. The risk you run with it in finance is it can be very data driven and actually like not be that helpful on the sales side and not be as helpful in driving the business forward, getting deals done, or like you as CFO get sucked into closing deals. And that's like usually like skill set or like best for the business anyway.
Yeah, I was way too into deal desk until I hired my director of FP&A like a year ago.
Yeah, makes sense. Talking like on tech stack for a minute, you said earlier we were prepping for this, you moved off of QuickBooks probably too late in the accounting stack. Kind of how did you think about tech stack, and like what's your tech stack today?
Yeah, so we originally were on QuickBooks, that we inherited that from our outsourced accounting firm. I'll say that our tech stack today is we're on Rillet for our ERP. We use Aleph for our like FP&A tool, and then we have Rippling for payroll, and we use like Brex for virtual cards. We also do use Rippling for some of our AP stuff, but we've simplified a lot of the tech stack. And then our CRM Salesforce, we use Snowflake for some of our internal data stuff. But those are kind of like the core data systems. We started evaluating leaving QuickBooks early to middle of last year. Basically, we got to the point where month-end close was a nightmare. We had 4 entities and across 3 countries, and so we had 4 QuickBooks instances. It was causing pain with us trying to close the books in even 6 days, which was too slow for me. We want to be able to run the business faster than that. And there was also all sorts of we have over 25,000 customers. They all get invoiced monthly, which is it's way too many invoices to process in QuickBooks, and so reconciliations became extremely challenging. Also, so I would say it was too late in that sense, but we also got the implementation done before we started our even closing balance pre-work for the audit, and so we did it, I guess, right in time. But doing it again, I would definitely do it a little bit earlier.
Would you recommend it more like 25, 50 million? Like when would be your recommended time?
Yeah, I think that used to be a much harder question. I think that the sort of scale up startup ERP space didn't exist very well 4 or 5 years ago, right? Like you're going to go from QuickBooks to like Intact or Sage or Xero maybe. And those things made sense, but it was mostly you were pushing off how long until you moved to NetSuite or SAP or something like that. I think now that there's an actual environment of true scaling ERPs that go from startup, really core mid-market all the way up to true enterprise and later, I think it makes a lot more sense to start looking earlier.
Yeah. I'm a little biased, obviously, but I think that too.
Nice. Makes sense. And maybe taking one step back to the early days, Chris, something I think is very interesting. I was seeing the results of some of the surveys that the team was sending, and most people here are either teams of 1 or 2, or at most 3 people in the audience. It gets very lonely. And I think that, I have a lot of direct reports of mine that are teams of 1 today, and I am their peer, but I'm not fully their peer. What do you use in order to stay connected to other finance people, communities that you had, success being a participant in? Yeah, I know that's something that you're very active on, so we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely lonely, especially before you start scaling up the team. This is my second first finance hire in a row. And so I spent, probably cumulative, like nearly a year and a half as like the only person in finance and accounting across those two roles. And some companies do it even longer than that, which is impressive. I would say that like, the key one is making relationships across the company first, right? If you like really get to know the other leaders and like everybody else in the company, it'll make you a better finance leader. It'll also make things a lot easier when you have to make hard decisions. Just building those relationships super early. But at the end of the day, you can't really lean on the other leaders in the company if you have questions about accounting policy or about FP&A best practices. And so going out and finding some of those communities, there's tons on LinkedIn. There's Slack groups that I'm in a couple of those, largely vendor driven. That I think Airbase has one, SheetWiz has one. And so just like participating in those communities is really fun because you get to have like resources you can bounce ideas off of. You get to see what other questions people are asking, which can be maybe not perfect for your stage, but it might be something to think about ahead of time that you didn't think of before. And so, yeah, there's with the internet, and I think especially after like COVID, a lot of communities moved online because there was less of that in-office interaction.
Yeah, Brian just dropped in the chat. The F Suite as well is really awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Ben Murray's has a SaaS CFO Slack community that's really active. And then a lot of times like our investors have networks that somehow they don't tell us about and we have to ask about. So like good to ask your investors if they have some kind of CFO network. Sometimes it's Slack community, sometimes it's just email thread, but I've found that to be very useful in terms of like evaluating tools and even hires and just bouncing ideas off of. It is very lonely this early stage. I've been surprised what even like this week, I had a few calls with some other like early startup folks. And I expected it kind of be a waste of time, like they're not clear partners for us or something. But it's so refreshing to just be like, oh, you're really stressed too? Yeah, I'm really stressed too. Like just to be able to share the load a bit actually helped me like work better the rest of the day and the week. Like it was 30 minutes well spent, even though there wasn't anything productive that happened in that time. Like I think taking time to share some of those struggles with folks really makes a difference and kind of this absolute grind of the startup culture.
Yeah, absolutely. One of our investors did a matching program that they basically like once a month would match you with somebody either same level, different function, same level, same function, or different level, same function across their portfolio companies. And I met just a ton of really great people that way, learned a lot of new things, and like stay in contact with several of them to this day.
That's awesome. And speaking on relation on investors, Chris, how has your relationship with the board changed over time? Kind of thinking like both first coming in, were you like reporting to the board directly in board meetings from day one? How did that change? What is it like today?
Yeah, so I didn't initially report to the board. I started, attending to and presenting to board meetings like a year, 2 years ago. And it's been a kind of a learning process. I think as the company continues to grow, they've wanted to hear more directly from finance specifically. And so really like learning about, and as we brought on new investors too, like understanding like how does the board dynamic change? What sort of things are they looking for? And really learning how to both tell the story of the company performance as well as what's going on in our like long range planning based on the industry and macro trends that we're seeing. It also like changes based on the sophistication of your board too, right? I did board presentations the whole time when I was at a company from pre-seed through Series B, and just seeing like what those early board meetings were like compared to what they were like much later when there were more sophisticated investors and more established board members you just have to kind of feel it out and keep those relationships going.
What are some of like the key things you do now like in prep for board meetings that feel like massive unlocks for you?
Yeah, it's become much less of a scramble as we've gotten our timing down. We usually do our board meeting like somewhere between 12 and 15 business days after the end of the quarter. And so it used to be just an extreme scramble to get closed, get the data, get the deck put together. We managed to collapse our close down to about 3 days, and then FP&A close takes about another 1 business day. And so we actually have like a real time to do more narrative building. And the other big benefit there is that, we use the pre-meeting sometimes, right? sometimes it's really good to preview what's going to happen in the board meeting individually with board members, and having the time to be able to do that and get feedback ahead of time so we can really center the board meeting and make sure it's a really productive discussion that like helps add value and drive us forward.
I think, Chris, maybe one of the biggest flex about your tech stack and the setup that you build is that we're on business day number 8 after closing the quarter, which means that probably you have BOD meeting around the corner, and you're here spending time with us instead of scrambling. So I think like that's the biggest flex. It's like, you don't need to be, putting long hours because you've set up the right processes there.
Yeah, even with the 4th of July holiday weekend, we're closed.
Yeah.
We've already presented financial results to our team, and we're in board prep already.
Yeah, so if anyone here on the chat is like struggling with board meeting prep for Q2, you can come over to the right side and do what Chris does. I think that's great, and maybe that's also a good plug. Chris is a second time Aleph webinar panelist. The prior webinar that we did was actually about board meeting prep, and it was like a 45-minute long discussion with Andy, with Even App. So maybe someone, Adam or Lucas, maybe you can put the link in the chat for people to check that out, just so I don't ask all the same questions to you, Chris, again. So I think some of those will be covered there.
Good question from Brian in the chat there. Do you do board notes, board decks? Like, what's the actual format you use for the board?
So we use both. So we have a sort of a consolidated board deck that we use to run the meeting. And that's what we'll send it out like 48 hours ahead of time so they can look through the slides. And then that'll be what sort of like grounds the agenda for the actual meeting. But we do board notes as like the actual like prep for the meeting. And so we try and send those out about a week ahead of time so they can actually read through it. And we do those on a sort of a vertical structure. So there's 3 board pre-reads, 1 for G&A, 1 for S&M, 1 for PDE.
Oh, nice. I like that. Maybe like thinking like more kind of, we'll go to like audience questions soon, kind of open it up, but I'm thinking like maybe like 2 pieces of advice here, 2 questions. One, like what advice would you have for someone taking on their first head of finance role at a startup? And second, like what advice do you have for someone who wants to be the first finance hire at a startup? Like what do you have to do to be in a place to do that? Maybe we can break those up, but that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, let's start with if you want to be. I think that like if you want to get to that first finance hire type of role, it's trying to learn just as much as possible from the leaders you work for today. Is incredibly important, right? Make sure you get those opportunities to do some of the early stage things. But eventually, if you want to be a first finance hire, you need to get early stage experience. And so it's much harder to jump from like a Fortune 500 company finance, like senior analyst role or the manager role, to a first finance hire, because the environment and the pace are so different that you're just not going to find a lot of people who want that. And so, taking the plunge and jumping to an early stage startup, even if it's not the first finance hire, can be a really enlightening experience. And then it gives you sort of the grounding to be able to do it as the first finance hire. Advice for when you are the first finance hire, I think, the 2 big things are you have to be humble and you have to listen, right? Coming into a business, there's a bunch of stuff established. And so in order to be somebody effective in the finance role, you have to like deeply understand the nuances of the business. I think that's true across all companies. And the best way to do that is like really just like strap in and talk to everybody as much as you can and get a feel for it. Spend a ton of time with the founders and like understand like what their vision is for the company, why they built things the way they did, and what they've seen as both the positives and the challenges so far. And then the other thing is like, be willing to spend your time learning. You're not going to know everything as the first finance hire. It's just not possible. And things are going to come up. And so using those communities, using your resources to like learn and ask questions, and like not hesitating to ask for help when you need it, because it's incredibly important also that we're going to make mistakes, but not making big mistakes and knowing how to immediately and quickly correct for any mistakes is like essential at this stage.
Yeah. Any early mistakes you can share?
Let's see.
Not implementing Rillet fast enough. That's
Yeah.
one that we already talked about. So
there were we ran into some issues with commissions once. We did not have a good process in place for like calculating commissions. And so we had a fundamental flaw where something broke in our data pipeline and we didn't notice it, and we didn't have the right checks in place. And so we actually ended up mispaying an entire commission payroll run in both directions. Like some people got underpaid, some people got overpaid, and like unwinding that mess was just a disaster, right? We were able to quickly remedy it and make sure people's paychecks were fixed. But like, you don't ever want to have to send a payroll run 5 days, extra payroll run 5 days late. And you definitely never want to have to pull money back from employees if you can avoid it. And so, that was one that I learned that like you really need a good process to check things and like make sure that there's a strong vetting, even if you need to find somebody in a different department to help with that, right? If you're the only finance person and you have to run all this, say like, hey, maybe your partner in HR, be like, I'd really love to have just a second set of eyes on this. You also see the payroll run every time. Like, take a look at this, see if you notice anything, but also just building in like the general checks and everything that you should be doing.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. I wish I could say I've always paid commissions out correctly, but that would be a lie. So I empathize.
Having good written comp plans is also clutch for that, like making sure that you have it documented and can point to exactly what it's structured as.
Yeah, and consistent across folks is good too. I find like that often is like an unlock for almost like everything across the business. And sometimes it's very hard because often finance is not the driver of business process, and for better or worse, right? Like sales has to close a deal, like whatever. So they want to structure this deal a certain way, and fine. Maybe that's the right thing for the business, but often this has very negative impacts downstream for finance. But kind of building the process, like when we have mandate, especially on commissions or something, can make mistakes like that a lot more rare when things are simple and clean. Well, or maybe we can jump to like audience questions quickly. I know we're coming up on time here, and there's quite a few good ones like in here. I want to start with one from the top. Maybe Chris, start with you. But as you scale teams, how did you balance growth and automation of workflows across all the aspects versus growth and headcount? I think it's especially interesting now with AI and like automation and new tools. But like, how did you think about that both maybe early on and now?
Yeah, I think maybe it's overly rudimentary, but like if it's cheaper to use a tool than hire a person, I will always try that first, with the caveat that like there are some things that you can't take the time to figure out how to fully automate, right? Billing ops was a big one for us. Like we were having we were collecting only like 92% of our invoicing. And once that became like a clear issue, it was like, okay, so we can like invest a bunch of time and resources into like building out this automated process. That's the right decision long term, but how many months are we going to waste in that time, right? And so I went ahead and said, okay, let's pull the trigger on it. We're going to hire a human being to run basically AR, making sure they're contacting customers who are like paid, getting accounts cleaned up if they're not being invoiced correctly and stuff like that. And we've worked over the last year and a half to rebuild that kind of the automation in the workflow now. We still have plenty of work to do for the human being we hired for that as we scale, which is it ended up being a nice benefit that we had that role. But I think trying to automate first is like the general default, but sometimes it's gonna be a lot quicker and a lot more impactful to like hire somebody and then figure out the automation later.
And maybe, Chris, there's one related question that maybe we can do next here from Matt. Are there industry benchmarks or standards that would support a case for expanding our finance team as our company grows? And any data demonstrates finance staffing levels relative to company size or growth rate? So maybe talk about how much do you think about that and like external benchmarks versus we need to solve billing ops and we're just going to make the case individually Yeah, maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, industry benchmarks are lagging, right? Like they don't predict the future; they just tell you what's happened so far. And especially right now, there's a major paradigm shift. And so, we look at the benchmarks. We don't ever want to be above the benchmark, but I don't think a benchmark is permission to go spend money. I think you really need to look internally about what your business case is, what support you need, and use benchmarks as a ceiling, not a guide to how much you should spend.
Yeah, makes sense. Good question here from Christian, and don't need to speak to Rillet or Aleph, but thinking more like tech stack in general, like how do you evaluate vendors and decide like which one is the right one for you? Especially it feels like in a lot of buying processes, it's hard to differentiate until you really get your hands on the tool. How did you think about that? Maybe Rillet and Aleph if helpful, but just in general, what's your framework?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a couple ways to approach buying tools. One is figuring out what tools you think can augment your process and your stack and doing POCs to try them out, right? That's how we've come across several of our tools. We've been like early into companies that are like trying to launch something, and being a part of that early process like helps you see what their roadmap's looking like and how you can shape that. Like Rattle, for example, is one of our favorite tools. And we were super early on with Rattle, and we've ended up being able to scale that pretty infinitely. When it comes to more established processes that you like rip and replace is like a very different evaluation than adding a new software. And so making sure you have a defined process for like, what does a replacement evaluation look like versus what does a standing up a net new process look like? Because then the investment decision is different too. One, you already have budget and you may be willing to pay a little bit more for better feature sets. One, you have to justify the investment altogether. Is spending this money going to save us money? Is it going to give us capacity to drive the company to more revenue? Whatever it may be. But it's also okay to like try things out and then not work. That's okay. We've tried several softwares that we thought would make a big impact, or we thought could drive an ROI on them, and they haven't. And so just make sure you structure your contract in a way that you can get out of this.
I like that framework of just like everything is fixable. Yeah, I guess Jeff Bezos has a framework of like, is this a like door decision we can walk back out of, which is helpful, but it's good to remember, especially in startups where every decision feels hyper sensitive and important, like you're going to break the company. And sometimes that's the case, but normally everything's fixable.
Yeah, we use that framework all the time. Like one-way doors take a lot more scrutiny than two-way doors. And so we try to avoid walking through one-way doors unless it's like for sure conviction. But even moving from QuickBooks to Rillet, if it didn't work for whatever reason, I wouldn't call that a one-way door. It would have been a massive pain to migrate an ERP a second time within a year. But software decisions can always be fixed or undone.
Yeah. Thankfully, it was one-way door in that case, not a two-way.
Yep. Very good now.
Chris, wanted to do a quick follow-up into something that I think you're, maybe on one extreme of the market, that is how willing you are to work with very, very small teams. And I'm talking, teams of 5 people just like hacking away on an idea. Again, I think it's very different to evaluate those than it is to evaluate now, Rillet or that are like much further ahead as a company. How do you, when it's 5 dudes in a garage, like how do you go about evaluating, is this something good to, connect my financial data that has a lot of like security implications, spend time and energy with them when like, the market odds say that they will likely not work out. And again, you were able to pick Aleph and like, and we're still around, right? Like how you think about that? And it's almost thinking more as an investor than a finance leader in some way.
Yeah, I think it really depends a lot on how critical something is, right? I'm much less likely to pick a very early stage startup for something that's customer facing, that's present in our product, or drives like a critical process that could cause us to like not be able to generate revenue, not be able to service our customers, right? And so from that aspect, like there's lots of things especially from the business process and like internal operations side of things, that we're very comfortable going super early stage with, because it's trying to solve a problem that we haven't found another solution for. And in that sense, it's like more experimentation at that stage. Obviously, you still want to vet the companies and make sure that like they seem to have good stability, because the only thing worse than solving a problem is solving a problem and then having that solution shut down. But I think it makes a ton of sense to take bets on some early companies. You can also usually get them for relatively cheap in order to because they're early stage, they want the user base and they want the thought partnership. And so you're not risking a ton of money generally to get in early.
Chris reminds us that every renewal that he was one of our first 15 customers, and we still happily give Chris the discounted price even at the scale. So that's always it's a long-term moat in some way.
Mm-hmm. That's very good ROI at that point.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe one that is interesting, going back to some of like the board dynamics here from Leonard. How involved have you been with the funding of the company and like raising money, and how has that changed over time? You talked that you were before Series C when you first joined. How involved were you in that process, and do you end up getting more involved as time progressed?
Yeah, I think that one's super dependent on your founders basically. If your founders are like highly experienced fundraisers, then like you may end up being somebody who is not involved until they start digging into the real financials. If your founders is more green, hasn't done a ton of fundraising experience, and you have, then like you may be in those rooms from the first conversation. And so my very first fundraise was at a startup like over 10 years ago now. That our CEO didn't want anything to do with fundraising, and so I was a senior analyst, and it was just me and the director of FP&A pitching to VC firms, which was a very weird dynamic. I wouldn't recommend that. But I think in a lot of ways that finance can drive a certain extent of fundraising, especially earlier stage, but investors aren't investing in your growth rate or your path to profitability at Series A, Series B. They're investing in the founders, and they're investing in the vision. And so finance is going to take a backseat. As you definitely get into that like Series C plus stage, the financials become much more important, right? Because now they're not trying to get 3 to 5x return on like a couple $100 million investment or like valuation. They're trying to get a 2 to 3x return on a multiple $100 million, billion plus valuation. And that becomes much harder to do if you don't have a clear financial picture.
Yeah, it would seem also a massive red flag to me as an investor to not have the founder or CEO in those discussions. Like whoever is going to be leading this business is not the one I'm talking to.
Yeah.
Do these finance folks have any authority to do anything here? The founder needs to kind of drive that vision all the way through.
Yeah. That company didn't make it very long.
Yeah.
People shouldn't go to your LinkedIn, Chris, to check the company. So we'll keep it private.
It's fine. It's been closed for like 8 years.
Makes sense. Let's maybe see. I know, Stephen, if there's any that you want to bring up here.
There's one very self-serving question about like, what about Rillet convinced you that it was the best option?
Let's
right?
do it.
And maybe the right way to frame this is the default for literally the last decade has been NetSuite, right? Like whether we like it or not, one gets fired for buying NetSuite. Like it's no surprise there. If I was going back into a traditional finance role, like I would look at NetSuite, right? Or Sage. Yeah. But What convinced you, without like pitching us too much, I don't care, right? But like what convinced you that Rillet was the right fit for you guys at your stage?
Yeah, for us, we had some grace because we have some timing, right? Like we're not going to go public in the next 12 to 24 months, right? Especially with the backlog of large, successful public companies or private companies that still need to go public probably before we get there. And so we had a little bit of time, and we know that we didn't need to make the perfect decision right now. Like we had room to take a shot on something that we thought had a ton of promise and we thought would be much better for our business, which was a very fortunate position to be in. The other thing was just like thinking about my previous experience with NetSuite. I've run NetSuite migrations before. It sucked. It takes way longer than you expect. It costs way more money than you expect. And we were on a timeline. We wanted to get done before we did our audit. and we knew that there was no way we were going to hit it on NetSuite. It doesn't matter that they told us they could do it in 4 months. They wouldn't. It just doesn't happen like that. And so I think those are the two biggest things that gave me the comfort to go outside of the easy decision, the don't get fired decision. And then we did evaluate a lot of different platforms. For us, we felt really good about Rillet because of the vision that y'all have and the accounting expertise you have on staff, which I think is a part of what differentiates Rillet from some of the other players in this space.
Yeah, we get a lot of like good marketing juice out of that, like built by accountants for accountants, but thankfully it happens to be true.
Yes.
And I think it actually makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Like when the people who like know the pain points build the tools, it's a big deal.
Yes.
Well, cool. It's been awesome, Chris. Like, thank you very much, Albert. Anything else you want to like add, or maybe Chris, like any parting thoughts? Like maybe like in with like, what's the best piece of advice you've gotten from a mentor, either like CFO on finance or maybe just on startup kind of scaling in general, that you either come back to often or like sits in the back of your head all the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely basic, but basically I learned from one of my earliest FP&A mentors to always be learning, and that FP&A impacts the entire business. So that means not learning just about FP&A or just about accounting. It means learning about everything that goes into driving and running business, right? And that mentor went on to found a YC company, or a company that got into YC. I was an advisor for them for a while, and so we maintained a good relationship. But it also meant that like I can use him and I can use other people I've met and continue to build my network and like learn from everybody that I can talk to. I love coming on these things, but I also love attending these types of webinars too, because you get to learn a ton of just a ton of information. You get to see new perspectives, and I think that's going to become even more important over this next couple of years, right? Like, I'm not one of the like AI doomsday is going to replace all accountants in the next 24 months, but I think it is going to make a major impact on AI is not going to replace accountants, but accountants who know how to use AI are going to replace accountants who don't, right? And I think being able to make sure that applies to everything. That applies to like all new tooling, it applies to all new processes, it applies to new tax codes and stuff like that too. Just like always be looking to better yourself and continue being at the top of your game.
Yeah, makes sense. In our interview process now, we ask, how are you using AI today? And if you're not using it, it's at least a yellow flag. Yeah, agreed. Chris, this has been awesome. Thank you very much for sharing thoughts and insights and journey, and even like being vulnerable on mistakes and sharing those. We, especially like on LinkedIn, we share a lot of the highs and like make sense, fair enough, but it's nice to dig into some of the troughs as well. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris. And just a reminder for everyone, we will send out the recording. There's a feedback survey, anonymous, when you exit out. We'd really love your feedback to help us improve these and bring more topics and speakers to light. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Happy Thursday.
Thank you. See you.